The dusty streets of Petaluma, California held secrets that everyone knew but pretended not to see, and Violet Randall had become the biggest secret of all, whispered about in parlors and avoided on sidewalks like a disease that might spread through simple eye contact. It was late September in 1878, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden planks of the general store's front porch, where Violet stood with her 3-year-old son, Thomas, clutching her worn cotton skirt. She had come into town to purchase flour and sugar, necessities she could no longer avoid buying despite knowing what awaited her. The store owner, Mr. Hutchins, had placed her items on the counter without a word, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. When she reached out to pay, he had pulled his hand back as though her touch might contaminate him. "Just leave the money on the counter," he had said, his voice cold and flat. Now outside, Violet felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that crying only made the townspeople feel more justified in their treatment of her. Thomas looked up at her with his wide brown eyes, innocent and unaware that his very existence was the reason they lived on the outskirts of everything decent, at least according to the good Christian folk of Petaluma. The whispers had started 4 years ago when she had returned from San Francisco, where she had gone to work as a seamstress. She had fallen in love with a man who promised her marriage, who had held her hands and spoken of a future filled with children and laughter. But when she had discovered she was carrying his child, he had disappeared like morning fog, leaving her alone and ruined. Her parents had died of fever when she was 16, leaving her with nothing but a small cabin on the edge of town, and skills with a needle that barely kept food on the table. Violet began walking down the street, her basket heavy on her arm, when she heard the sharp voice of Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife. "Cover your children's eyes, Margaret. We do not acknowledge such fallen women in front of impressionable young ones." The words struck like a physical blow, but Violet kept walking, her head high even as her heart crumbled into smaller and smaller pieces. Thomas squeezed her hand tighter, and she squeezed back, trying to pour all her love and reassurance into that simple gesture. They were nearly to the edge of town where the road turned to dirt and led to their isolated cabin when the sound of hoofbeats made Violet glance over her shoulder. A lone rider was approaching, sitting tall in his saddle, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. She moved to the side of the road, expecting him to pass by without notice like everyone else who came through Petaluma. But the rider slowed his horse, a magnificent chestnut mare, and stopped beside her. "Afternoon, madam," he said, tipping his hat. Violet looked up, surprised by the greeting. The man appeared to be in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was handsome in a rough, weathered way, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. He wore the typical garb of a traveling cowboy: dusty leather chaps, a worn vest over a blue cotton shirt, and a gun belt that hung low on his hips. "Good afternoon," Violet replied cautiously, unused to civil interaction. The cowboy's gaze dropped to Thomas, and his expression softened. "That is a fine-looking boy you have got there." Thomas, usually shy around strangers, smiled up at the man with surprising trust. "Say thank you, Thomas," Violet prompted gently. "Thank you, mister," Thomas said in his small voice. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and stood before them, holding his horse's reins loosely. "Name is Xavier Yates," he said, extending his hand to Violet. She hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The last thing she needed was to give the town more ammunition against her, but something in Xavier's open expression made her place her hand in his. His grip was warm and firm, his palm calloused from years of hard work. "Violet Randall," she said quietly. "And this is my son, Thomas." Xavier crouched down to Thomas's level, his movements slow and gentle. "How old are you, Thomas?" Thomas held up 3 fingers, still clutching his mother's skirt with his other hand. 3 years old, Xavier said with an approving nod. "That is a good age." "I reckon you help your mama out a lot, do you not?" Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "I help with the chickens." "Chickens are important work," Xavier said seriously, as though discussing matters of great consequence. He stood back up and looked at Violet, his gray eyes searching her face. "I am new to Petaluma, just rode in looking for work. Might you know if anyone around here is hiring ranch hands?" Violet thought for a moment, trying to ignore the way her heart had started beating faster under his gaze. "The Johnson Ranch might be looking for help. It is about 5 miles west of town. Mr. Johnson is getting older and could probably use an extra pair of hands." "Much obliged," Xavier said, settling his hat back on his head. He started to mount his horse, then paused and turned back to her. "I noticed the way those folks back there treated you. Just wanted to say I am sorry about that. Nobody deserves to be looked at like they are less than human." Violet's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. It had been so long since anyone had shown her basic kindness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," she managed to say. "Xavier, please," he said with a slight smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer. "I have a feeling we will be seeing each other again." He rode off toward the west, leaving Violet standing in the dusty road, her heart doing strange things in her chest that she had thought it would never do again. The next 2 weeks passed slowly. Violet kept herself busy with sewing work, taking in mending from the few ranches outside of town, whose owners were more concerned with practical matters than moral judgments. She made shirts and repaired torn pants, her fingers moving automatically while her mind wandered to gray eyes and a kind smile. She told herself she was being foolish. Xavier Yates was just a drifter passing through, and even if he was not, what man would want to tie himself to a woman with a child and a ruined reputation? She had learned her lesson about trusting men's pretty words. But late one afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin with Thomas playing nearby with his wooden horse, she heard the sound of hoofbeats again. Her heart jumped before she could stop it, and when she turned around, Xavier was dismounting near her fence. "Afternoon, Violet," he called out, and she noticed he had remembered her name without her having to remind him. "Mr. Yates," she said, wiping her damp hands on her apron. "Did Mr. Johnson hire you?" "He did indeed," Xavier said, walking toward her with easy confidence. "Good man, Mr. Johnson. Fair wages, and he does not talk a man's ear off, which I appreciate." He glanced at Thomas, who had dropped his toy and was staring at Xavier with wide eyes. "Hello there, Thomas. How are those chickens doing?" Thomas suddenly became animated, running up to Xavier without his earlier shyness. "One of them laid 2 eggs today. Mama said it was special. 2 eggs from 1 chicken. Now that is something," Xavier said, giving the matter the serious consideration it deserved in a 3-year-old's world. "You must be taking real good care of them." Thomas beamed with pride, and Violet felt something crack in the walls she had built around her heart. Watching this strong, capable man treat her son with such genuine respect and attention made her eyes sting with unshed tears. "Would you like some water?" she offered, trying to keep her voice steady. "You must be thirsty after working all day." "That would be mighty kind of you," Xavier said. Violet went inside her cabin, which consisted of 3 small rooms, a main living area with a kitchen corner, a bedroom she shared with Thomas, and a tiny room she used for her sewing work. It was not much, but she kept it clean and as comfortable as she could manage. She poured water from her pitcher into a tin cup and carried it back outside. Xavier had settled himself on the split-rail fence, and Thomas was showing him the wooden horse, explaining in elaborate detail the adventures the horse had been on that day. Xavier listened with the patience of a saint, asking questions and making comments that only encouraged Thomas further. "Here you are," Violet said, handing him the cup. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Violet felt a jolt of warmth travel up her arm. Xavier's eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch, a softness, an interest, maybe even attraction. "Thank you," he said, draining half the cup in one long swallow. "That hits the spot. What brings you by?" Violet asked, trying to sound casual even though her pulse was racing. "The Johnson Ranch is quite a ways from here. Thought I would check on you and Thomas," Xavier said simply. "See if you might need anything. Firewood chopped, fence repairs, anything like that." Violet blinked in surprise. "That is very kind, but I could not ask you to do that. You must be exhausted from your work at the ranch." "You did not ask, I offered," Xavier pointed out with that slight smile of his. "And I am used to hard work. Does not bother me none." "Why?" The question escaped before Violet could stop it. "Why would you want to help me? You do not even know me." Xavier finished his water and handed the cup back to her, his expression turning serious. "I have been traveling for a long time, Violet. I have seen a lot of places and a lot of people. I have learned that most folks are too quick to judge and too slow to show mercy. I have also learned that sometimes the people society treats the worst are actually the ones with the most courage and the strongest hearts." He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. "You walk through that town with your head held high while people treat you like dirt beneath their feet, all because you love your son and refuse to give him up. That takes more strength than most of those righteous hypocrites will ever have." Violet felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them. She turned away quickly, embarrassed by her display of emotion, but Xavier was down from the fence in an instant. "I am sorry," he said softly. "I did not mean to upset you." "You did not upset me," Violet said, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "It is just that nobody has said anything like that to me in so long. Most days I feel like maybe they are right about me, maybe I am what they say I am." "And what do they say you are?" Xavier asked gently. "A fallen woman, a sinner, someone who brought shame on herself and does not deserve to be treated with basic human decency." Xavier was quiet for a moment, then he said, "May I tell you what I see when I look at you?" Violet nodded, not trusting her voice. "I see a woman who works hard to provide for her child. I see someone who faces cruelty every day but still gets up and does what needs to be done. I see a mother who loves her son so much that she endures all of it without complaint. I see someone beautiful, strong, and worth knowing." He paused, then added quietly, "I would like to know you better if you would allow it." Violet's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You would court me, even knowing what everyone says about me." "I do not give a damn what everyone says about you," Xavier said, and there was steel in his voice. "I care about who you actually are, not what some narrow-minded gossips think they know." Thomas had wandered off to check on his chickens, giving them a moment of privacy. Violet looked up at Xavier, searching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motives, but all she saw was sincerity. "I have been hurt before," she admitted quietly. "Thomas's father made me promises he had no intention of keeping. I was young and naive, and I believed him. I cannot afford to make that mistake again." "I understand," Xavier said, "and I am not asking you to trust me right away. Trust is something that has to be earned. All I am asking is for a chance to prove that I am a man of my word." Violet took a deep breath, feeling as though she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to either fly or fall. "All right," she said finally. "You can call on us if you would like." The smile that spread across Xavier's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm and full of promise. "I would like that very much." Over the following weeks, Xavier became a regular presence in Violet's life. He would stop by after his work at the Johnson Ranch, always bringing something useful: nails for repairs, a sack of oats for the chickens, fresh vegetables from the ranch garden that Mr. Johnson had given him. He chopped firewood until Violet had enough to last through the winter, repaired the sagging porch steps, and fixed the leak in her roof that she had been trying to patch herself with limited success. But more than the practical help, Xavier brought something Violet had been missing for years: companionship. He would sit on her porch in the early evening while Thomas played, and they would talk about everything and nothing. He told her about his life, how he had grown up on a small ranch in Colorado, how his parents had died when he was 18 from a winter sickness, how he had spent the last 10 years drifting from place to place, working different ranches and never quite feeling like he belonged anywhere. "Why Petaluma?" Violet asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the rolling California hills. Xavier was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have been asking myself that same question. I had planned to keep heading south, maybe find work near San Diego, but something made me stop here." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft in the fading light. "Now I think I know what it was." Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was sitting close enough to Xavier that their shoulders were almost touching, and she was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the smell of leather and honest sweat, the sound of his steady breathing. "Thomas has really taken to you," she said, glancing at her son who was trying to catch fireflies in the growing dusk. "He is a good boy," Xavier said. "Smart too. The other day he was telling me about the different kinds of clouds he has seen." "I do not think I knew that much about clouds when I was 3 times his age." Violet smiled. "He asks questions about everything. Sometimes I run out of answers and have to make things up, which probably is not good parenting." "You are a wonderful mother," Xavier said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see that. The people in town do not seem to think so." "The people in town are fools." Violet laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in her belly, and she realized how good it felt. She had not laughed like that in years. Xavier looked at her with such warmth that it made her breath catch. "You should laugh more often," he said softly. "It suits you." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and warm, his fingers strong as they intertwined with hers. "Is this all right?" he asked. "Yes," Violet whispered, her heart racing. They sat like that until full dark fell and Violet had to take Thomas inside for bed. Xavier helped her bank the fire in the stove and check the door latch, small domestic tasks that felt surprisingly intimate. "I will see you tomorrow?" he asked as he prepared to mount his horse. "Yes," Violet said, and realized that she was already counting the hours until he returned. After Xavier left, Violet got Thomas ready for bed, helping him into his nightshirt and tucking him under the quilts she had sewn herself. As she brushed the hair back from his forehead, Thomas looked up at her with his serious eyes. "Mama, is Mr. Xavier going to be my papa?" The question caught Violet completely off guard. "I do not know, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" "Because he is nice to us, and he makes you smile." "You do not smile much anymore." Violet felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had tried so hard to shield Thomas from the hardships of their life, but children were more perceptive than adults gave them credit for. "You like Mr. Xavier?" she asked. Thomas nodded emphatically. "He is the best. He talks to me like I am big, not little." He does do that, Violet agreed, kissing Thomas's forehead. Now go to sleep. We have a busy day tomorrow. But after Thomas drifted off, Violet lay awake in the darkness, thinking about Xavier's hand holding hers, his smile, the way he treated her son with such genuine affection. She was falling for him, she could not deny it any longer. But the fear remained, lodged like a stone in her chest. What if he left? What if he decided the stigma of being with her was too much? What if he was like Thomas's father, all sweet words and empty promises? The next day was Sunday, which meant that most of the town would be at church. Violet never went anymore, not after the day Reverend Michaels had asked her to leave, saying her presence was offensive to the congregation. She had walked out with as much dignity as she could muster, but the humiliation had burned like acid. Instead, she spent Sundays at home, reading to Thomas from the few books she owned and doing light chores. She was surprised when Xavier rode up around noon, dressed in what appeared to be his best clothes, clean pants and a pressed shirt. "I thought you would be at church," Violet said, stepping out onto the porch. "I went to the early service," Xavier said, dismounting. "Wanted to come see you before the afternoon got away from me." The early service. Violet had not known there was an early service. "Mr. Johnson told me about it. It is held at 6 in the morning, mostly for the ranch hands and workers who cannot make the regular service." Much smaller group, less judgmental too, from what I could tell. Xavier reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought something for Thomas." Thomas came running out of the cabin, having heard Xavier's voice, and Xavier handed him the package. Thomas tore it open with the enthusiasm only a child could muster, revealing a small leather ball. "A ball," Thomas shouted with delight. "Look, Mama, a ball." "What do you say?" Violet prompted. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. You are very welcome," Xavier said, ruffling Thomas's hair. "Want to throw it around for a bit?" For the next half hour, Violet watched from the porch as Xavier and Thomas played together. Xavier was endlessly patient, retrieving the ball when Thomas's throws went wild, cheering when Thomas managed to catch it, making the whole thing feel like the most important game in the world. Watching them, Violet felt something shift inside her. This was what Thomas needed, what she needed. Not just survival, but joy. Not just existence, but living. When Thomas finally tired himself out and went inside to play with his wooden animals, Xavier joined Violet on the porch steps. "You are good with him," Violet said. "He makes it easy," Xavier replied. "He is a special boy, Violet. You have done an amazing job raising him." "I have tried my best," Violet said, "but I worry sometimes that my best is not enough. He deserves a normal life, not one where he is treated like an outcast because of my mistakes." Xavier turned to face her fully, his expression intense. "First of all, Thomas is not a mistake. He is a blessing. And second, the only people making his life difficult are the same people who would find something to gossip about no matter what. That is who they are, not who you are." "But they will never accept me," Violet said. "Which means they will never accept him either." "Then we will change their minds," Xavier said firmly. "We," Violet echoed, her heart skipping. Xavier took her hand again, just as he had the night before. "Violet, I know we have not known each other long, but I need you to understand something. I am not the kind of man who plays games or makes promises I cannot keep. When I commit to something, I see it through." "What are you saying?" Violet asked, barely breathing. "I am saying that I am falling in love with you," Xavier said, his gray eyes locked on hers. "I am saying that I want to be part of your life, yours and Thomas's. I am saying that I do not care what anyone in this town thinks, and I am going to make sure they see what I see, that you are worthy of respect and kindness." Tears were streaming down Violet's face again, but this time they were tears of joy mixed with fear. "I am falling in love with you too," she admitted. "But Xavier, you do not know what you are signing up for. The way they treat me, it will extend to you too once they know we are courting." "Let them try," Xavier said with a hint of steel in his voice. "I have faced down stampeding cattle, rattlesnakes, and men with guns. I am not afraid of some small-minded gossips." Violet laughed through her tears. "You really mean this? Every word?" Xavier lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I am going to court you properly, Violet Randall, and then, if you will have me, I am going to marry you." The word marry hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Violet had never imagined she would hear that word again, not directed at her with genuine intention behind it. "I would like that," she whispered. Xavier's smile was brilliant. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull back, and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. It was soft and sweet, full of promise and restraint, the kiss of a man who understood that trust had to be earned and love had to be built on a foundation of respect. When they pulled apart, Violet felt like she was glowing from the inside out. The next week, Xavier made good on his word. He began accompanying Violet into town when she needed supplies, walking beside her with his hand on the small of her back, his presence both protective and proud. The townspeople did not know what to make of it at first. They were used to Violet slinking through their streets like a kicked dog, but now she walked with confidence, a handsome cowboy at her side who looked ready to challenge anyone who dared to speak against her. The first real confrontation came at the general store. Violet was purchasing thread and fabric for a sewing project when Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife who had made those cruel comments weeks earlier, walked in with her daughter. "I cannot believe they allow her kind in here," Mrs. Pemberton said loudly to her daughter, not even trying to be subtle. "It is disgraceful." Xavier, who had been examining some tools on the other side of the store, set down what he was holding and walked over to Mrs. Pemberton with measured steps. "Excuse me, madam," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I believe you are speaking about Miss Randall, Mrs." Pemberton drew herself up, clearly not used to being challenged. "I am. And who might you be?" "Xavier Yates, madam. I work at the Johnson Ranch." He paused, then said, "I could not help but overhear your comment, and I feel obliged to correct your misunderstanding. Miss Randall is one of the finest women I have had the privilege of knowing. She works hard, raises her son with love and care, and conducts herself with more grace than most people could manage under far easier circumstances. So I would appreciate it if you would show her the respect she deserves." The store had gone completely silent. Mr. Hutchins stood behind the counter with his mouth slightly open, clearly shocked. Mrs. Pemberton's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she sputtered. "You know who I am." "I know exactly who you are, madam," Xavier said calmly. "You are someone who has forgotten that judgment belongs to God alone, and that Jesus himself spent his time with those society deemed unworthy. I would think a church-going woman would remember that. Mrs. Pemberton opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water, unable to form a response. Finally, she grabbed her daughter's arm and swept out of the store in a huff. Xavier turned to Mr. Hutchins. "If you would be so kind as to finish ringing up Miss Randall's purchases, I would be much obliged." Mr. Hutchins, looking somewhat chastened, quickly tallied up Violet's items and accepted her payment without comment. As they left the store, Violet was trembling, though whether from anger, fear, or gratitude, she was not entirely sure. "You did not have to do that," she said once they were outside. "Yes, I did," Xavier said firmly. "And I will do it again every single time someone treats you with disrespect." Eventually, they will get the message. Word spread quickly through Petaluma about Xavier's defense of Violet. The reactions were mixed. Some people, particularly the older generation who held the strictest views on morality, were scandalized that a man would associate himself with a fallen woman. But others, especially some of the younger folks and the working men who respected Xavier for his skill and work ethic, began to question whether they had been too harsh in their judgment. Mr. Johnson, Xavier's employer, summoned him to the main house one evening about 3 weeks into his courtship with Violet. Xavier went with some trepidation, unsure if he was about to be fired for causing trouble in town. Mr. Johnson was a man in his 60s, weathered by years of ranching, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He invited Xavier to sit on the porch and handed him a cup of coffee. "I have been hearing things about you in town," Mr. Johnson said without preamble. "Yes, sir," Xavier said, meeting his eyes directly. "I suppose you have. You are courting Violet Randall." "I am, sir." Mr. Johnson took a sip of his coffee, studying Xavier over the rim of the cup. "You know her story." "I know what she has told me, and I know what the town says about her." "I believe her version, not theirs." "Smart man," Mr. Johnson said, surprising Xavier. "I knew Violet's parents. Good people, salt of the earth. They died too young, left that girl with nothing. She went to San Francisco trying to make a life for herself, and some scoundrel took advantage of her youth and her loneliness. When she came back here carrying a child, folks decided to be righteous instead of Christian, if you understand my meaning." Xavier nodded, relief washing through him. "You do not think less of her." "I think she has more courage than most," Mr. Johnson said. "Takes a strong woman to keep going when the whole world turns against her. My wife wanted to reach out to her, help her, but Violet is too proud to accept charity." He paused, then added, "But she might accept help from a friend." "Are you saying what I think you are saying, sir?" "I am saying that my wife needs help with her sewing. Her arthritis has gotten bad and she can barely hold a needle anymore. If Violet Randall were willing to come to the ranch once or twice a week to do mending and sewing work, we would pay her fair wages, better than whatever she is scraping together now." Xavier felt a surge of gratitude for this old rancher. "I will ask her, sir. I am sure she would appreciate the opportunity." "Good." Mr. Johnson finished his coffee and stood. "One more thing, Yates. You are a fine worker, one of the best I have had in years. But more than that, you are a good man. I would hate to lose you." Xavier stood as well, understanding the unspoken message. "You will not lose me, sir. I intend to make Petaluma my home." "Glad to hear it. Now get on out of here. That girl and her boy are probably waiting for you." Xavier rode to Violet's cabin with his heart lighter than it had been in years. When he arrived, he found Violet in her sewing room, working by lamplight while Thomas slept in the next room. She looked up when he knocked softly on the door frame, her face brightening at the sight of him. "You are late tonight," she said, setting down her work. "I was starting to worry." "I was talking to Mr. Johnson," Xavier said, stepping into the small room, "and I have some good news." He told her about the job offer, and he watched as disbelief, hope, and finally joy played across her face. "Mrs. Johnson wants me to work for her." Violet repeated as if she could not quite believe it. "She does. Fair wages, steady work, and you can bring Thomas with you. The Johnsons have grandchildren who visit sometimes, and Mrs. Johnson loves having young ones around." Violet pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "This is too much. First you, and now this." Xavier crossed the room and pulled her gently into his arms. She came willingly, resting her head against his chest while he held her close. He could feel her trembling, releasing years of tension and fear and loneliness. "You deserve good things, Violet," he murmured into her hair. "You deserve kindness and opportunity and love. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have all of that." Violet pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her eyes were red from crying, but they were also full of love. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I think I am the lucky one," Xavier said, and then he kissed her properly this time, with passion and promise and all the emotions he had been holding back. Violet kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands gripping his shirt, and for a long moment the world outside ceased to exist. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Violet." "I know it is fast, but I have never been more certain of anything. Marry me and let me be a father to Thomas and a husband to you." "Yes," Violet whispered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They set a date for 6 weeks later, which gave them time to make preparations and, more importantly, gave the town time to adjust to the idea. Xavier bought a simple gold band from the jeweler in town, and the transaction alone caused a stir of gossip. But he did not care. He wore his intentions proudly, telling anyone who asked that he was marrying Violet Randall, and they were invited to the wedding if they could find it in their hearts to be happy for them. The response was mixed, as expected. Some people, like the Pemberton family and Reverend Michaels, made it clear they would not attend and would not condone such a union. But others surprised them. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson offered to host the wedding at their ranch. Several of the ranch hands Xavier worked with congratulated him and said they would be there. And slowly, a few women from town, ones who had perhaps felt the sting of judgment themselves for lesser reasons, reached out to Violet with quiet words of support. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose own daughter had run off with a gambler years ago, appeared at Violet's door one afternoon with a bolt of beautiful white fabric. "For your wedding dress," she said simply. "Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day." Violet accepted the gift with trembling hands and gratitude so profound she could barely speak. As the wedding approached, Violet spent her evening sewing her dress by lamplight while Xavier read to Thomas from a book of adventure stories he had purchased. It was a routine they had fallen into easily, this domestic life that felt both new and ancient, as though they had been doing it forever. One evening, about 2 weeks before the wedding, Thomas climbed into Xavier's lap during story time, a gesture of trust and affection that made both Violet and Xavier's eyes misty. "Mr. Xavier," Thomas said seriously, "when you marry Mama, can I call you Papa?" Xavier's throat worked as he struggled with emotion. He looked at Violet, who nodded through her own tears, and then back at Thomas. "I would be honored if you called me Papa," Xavier said, his voice rough. "That is the greatest gift you could give me." Thomas beamed and wrapped his small arms around Xavier's neck. "I love you, Papa." "I love you too, son," Xavier said, and it was true. He had come to love Thomas as deeply as if the boy were his own blood. In his heart, Thomas already was his son. The night before the wedding, according to tradition, Xavier stayed at the bunkhouse at the Johnson Ranch while Violet remained at the cabin with Thomas. He lay awake for hours, thinking about the path that had led him here. He had spent 10 years drifting, never quite finding where he belonged, and then he had ridden into Petaluma on a whim and found everything he had been searching for without knowing it. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the California sun warm but not oppressive. The ceremony was to be held at noon at the Johnson Ranch, in the garden that Mrs. Johnson tended with such care. Xavier arrived early, dressed in his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed and his face clean-shaven for the first time in months. The ranch hands had helped set up chairs in rows facing an arbor that Mr. Johnson had built years ago. It was covered in climbing roses that filled the air with their sweet scent. About 30 people trickled in as noon approached, more than Xavier had dared to hope for. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson sat in the front row, smiling widely. The ranch hands filled several rows, along with some of their wives and children. Even a few townspeople came, including Mr. Hutchins from the general store and several others, who had apparently decided that perhaps they had been too harsh in their judgment. A traveling preacher who served several small towns in the area agreed to perform the ceremony. He was a younger man than Reverend Michaels, with a kindness in his eyes that spoke of genuine faith rather than rigid dogma. And then, precisely at noon, Violet appeared. She walked toward the arbor with Thomas at her side holding her hand, and Xavier felt his breath leave his body. The white dress she had sewn herself was simple but elegant, fitted at the waist and flowing to the ground. Her dark hair was pinned up with small white flowers woven through it, and her face glowed with happiness and love. Thomas looked proud in a new shirt and pants that Violet had made for him, walking solemnly beside his mother like a small guard of honor. When they reached the arbor, Thomas stepped to the side, standing between Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, who had agreed to watch him during the ceremony. Violet took Xavier's hands, and he was surprised to find that his were shaking. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, just for her. "You are pretty handsome yourself," she whispered back with a smile that made his heart race. The preacher began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, about partnership and faith. But Xavier barely heard them. He was too focused on Violet, on the feel of her hands in his, on the way the sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, on the knowledge that this incredible woman was about to become his wife. When it came time for the vows, Xavier spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the garden. "I, Xavier Yates, take you, Violet Randall, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to be a good husband to you and a good father to Thomas. I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, to defend you against anyone who would harm you, and to build a life with you filled with laughter and love. This I swear before God and these witnesses." Violet's eyes were shining with tears as she spoke her own vows, her voice steady despite the emotion. "I, Violet Randall, take you, Xavier Yates, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to be a good wife to you and a good partner in all things. I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, to support your dreams, and to build a life with you and Thomas filled with joy and love. This I swear before God and these witnesses." The preacher smiled at them both. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Xavier, you may kiss your bride." Xavier cupped Violet's face in his hands and kissed her tenderly, hearing the applause and cheers of their guests but caring only about the woman in his arms, his wife. When they pulled apart, they were both grinning like fools. Thomas ran up to them and Xavier scooped him into his arms while keeping one arm around Violet. "We are a family now," Xavier said to Thomas. "You, me, and your mama." "A real family," Thomas said happily, and it was the best wedding vow of all. The reception was simple but joyful. Mrs. Johnson had prepared a feast with help from several of the ranch women, and there was fiddle music and dancing. Xavier danced with Violet first, holding her close while they swayed to a slow song, oblivious to everyone else. "I never thought I would have this," Violet murmured against his chest. "A wedding, a husband who loves me, people actually celebrating with us instead of condemning us. It feels like a dream." "It is real," Xavier assured her. "I am real and I am not going anywhere." Later, as the sun began to set and the party wound down, Mr. Johnson pulled Xavier aside. "I have a proposal for you," he said. I have been thinking about retiring in a few years, and I need someone I can trust to take over managing the ranch. You have proven yourself to be capable and trustworthy. If you are interested, I would like to train you to eventually run this place. It would come with a house, the foreman's house that is sitting empty right now. Big enough for a family. Xavier was stunned. Sir, I do not know what to say. Say yes, Mr. Johnson said with a smile. You have a family now, Yates. They need stability, a real home. And I need someone who will care for this ranch the way I have. Seems like we can help each other out. Then yes, Xavier said, shaking the older man's hand firmly. Thank you, sir. You will not regret this. I know I will not. When Xavier told Violet about the offer later, as they were preparing to leave for their own cabin where they would spend their first night as a married couple, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly. A real house, she breathed, and a future that is actually stable and secure. Xavier, you have given me everything I thought I had lost forever. We have given each other everything, Xavier corrected, holding her close. I was drifting before I found you. Now I have a purpose, a family, a home. You saved me just as much as you think I saved you. They collected Thomas, who had fallen asleep on Mrs. Johnson's lap during the party, and rode back to the cabin in the wagon that Xavier had borrowed. The night was beautiful. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, and Violet leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. At the cabin, Xavier carried Thomas inside and laid him gently in his bed while Violet lit the lamps. When Xavier emerged from the bedroom, he found his wife waiting for him, and the love in her eyes took his breath away. "Hello, husband," she said softly. "Hello, wife," he replied, crossing to her and pulling her into his arms. They made love that night with tenderness and passion, sealing their commitment to each other in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, lying tangled together in the sheets, Violet traced patterns on Xavier's chest and thought about how much her life had changed in just a few months. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, running his fingers through her loose hair. "How lucky I am," Violet said, "and how brave you were to stand up for me when nobody else would." "That was not bravery," Xavier said. "That was just recognizing the truth when I saw it." "You are an incredible woman, Violet. The whole town is going to realize that eventually." And slowly, over the following months, the town did begin to change their opinion. It started with small things. Mr. Hutchins began greeting Violet by name when she came into the store. Mrs. Patterson invited her to join the church sewing circle, a group that met weekly to make quilts for families in need. A few other women, emboldened by Mrs. Patterson's acceptance, also extended tentative olive branches. Not everyone came around. Mrs. Pemberton and her circle of friends remained staunchly disapproving, and Reverend Michaels continued to preach about the dangers of moral laxity. But their voices grew quieter as more people chose kindness over judgment. The move to the foreman's house happened 3 months after the wedding. It was a substantial home with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a sitting room, and even a separate room that Violet could use for her sewing work. Thomas was thrilled to have his own bedroom, and Violet cried happy tears as she walked through the spacious rooms, hardly believing they were hers. Xavier threw himself into learning how to manage the ranch, working closely with Mr. Johnson to understand every aspect of the operation. He proved to have a natural aptitude for leadership, earning the respect of the ranch hands through his fair treatment and willingness to work just as hard as he asked them to work. Violet continued her sewing work for Mrs. Johnson and began taking on additional clients as word spread about the quality of her work. The extra income was welcome, but more than that, She appreciated feeling useful and valued for her skills. On Thomas's 4th birthday, they had a small party at their new house. Several children from the ranch families came, and even a few from town, their parents apparently willing to let their children play with Thomas now that the Yates family had gained some measure of respectability. Watching Thomas laugh and play with other children, no longer isolated and alone, brought tears to Violet's eyes. Xavier wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "He is happy," Xavier said. "He is," Violet agreed. "We all are." That night, after Thomas had gone to bed exhausted from his party, Violet had some news for Xavier. She had been waiting for the right moment, and this day of celebration seemed perfect. "Xavier," she said as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out. "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him look at her with concern. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong," Violet said quickly, taking his hand. "Everything is very right, actually. I am going to have a baby." Xavier stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he was grinning like a madman. "A baby," he repeated. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Violet said, laughing at his reaction. "In about 6 months, if my calculations are correct." Xavier let out a whoop of joy that probably woke half the ranch, then scooped Violet up and spun her around carefully. When he set her back down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "I love you so much," he said. "You have made me the happiest man alive." "I love you too," Violet said. "And Xavier, thank you for everything, for seeing me when everyone else looked away, for loving Thomas as your own, for giving us a life I never dreamed we could have." "You do not have to thank me for loving you," Xavier said softly. "That is the easiest thing I have ever done." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Violet felt well, just some morning sickness in the early months that soon passed. Xavier was attentive and protective, almost comically so, worrying about her doing too much work or lifting anything heavy. Mrs. Johnson took Violet under her wing, sharing advice and old remedies, treating her like the daughter she never had. Thomas was excited about becoming a big brother, though he did not quite understand what it meant. He would talk to Violet's growing belly, telling his future sibling about his chickens and his wooden animals and all the things they would do together when the baby arrived. In April of 1879, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the morning, Violet gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Xavier was there the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering words of encouragement. When the midwife finally placed the baby in Violet's arms, both parents wept with joy. "He is perfect," Xavier said, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. The baby immediately gripped it, and Xavier's face showed such wonder that Violet fell in love with him all over again. "What should we name him?" Violet asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on anything definite, wanting to wait until they met their son to see what felt right. Xavier looked at the baby thoughtfully. "What do you think of Benjamin?" "It means son of my right hand, someone you can rely on." "Benjamin Yates," Violet said, testing it out. "I love it. Benjamin Thomas Yates, giving him Thomas's name as a middle name," Xavier smiled. "That is perfect." When they brought baby Benjamin home, Thomas was entranced by his new brother. He wanted to help with everything, from fetching diapers to singing him lullabies that he made up on the spot. Xavier watched his sons, one by blood and one by choice, and knew that his heart could not possibly hold any more love. The years that followed were the happiest Violet had ever known. Xavier officially took over as ranch foreman when Mr. Johnson stepped back, and he managed the operation with skill and dedication. The ranch prospered under his leadership. and the respect he had earned only grew. Violet's sewing business expanded until she had more work than she could handle. She eventually hired 2 women from town to help her, providing them with good wages and a supportive work environment. It gave her deep satisfaction to help other women earn honest livings. Thomas started school when he turned 6, and while there were still a few children whose parents had taught them to be cruel, most of the kids accepted him without question. He was bright and curious, excelling in his studies, and he adored his little brother Benjamin, who toddled after him whenever possible. When Benjamin was 2 years old, Violet discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. She had Violet's dark hair and Xavier's gray eyes, and she wrapped her father around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. Xavier proved to be a wonderful father to all 3 children. He taught Thomas to ride and rope, spent hours playing with Benjamin's toy soldiers, and could be found most evenings with Sarah in his arms, rocking her to sleep while he sang off-key lullabies. Watching him with their children, Violet often marveled at how different her life had turned out from what she had expected. The town of Petaluma continued to change over the years. New families moved in, and old prejudices slowly faded. Violet was eventually invited to join the ladies' auxiliary at the church, a clear sign that she had been fully accepted into the community. She almost declined, the wounds from her earlier rejection still tender, but Xavier encouraged her to go. "Show them who you really are," he said. "Show them the woman I fell in love with." So she went, and she found that most of the women there were kind and welcoming. Even Mrs. Pemberton, now much older and perhaps mellowed by time, offered a stiff but genuine apology for her past behavior. "I was wrong about you," Mrs. Pemberton said. "I let my judgment cloud my Christian charity. I am sorry for the pain I caused." Violet accepted the apology with grace, understanding that forgiveness was often harder than anger but much more freeing. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Violet on a picnic to the spot where they had first kissed, leaving the children with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson for the afternoon. They spread a blanket on the soft grass and ate the lunch Violet had packed while talking about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of 2 people who knew each other deeply. "You remember that first day we met?" Xavier asked, lying back on the blanket with his hands behind his head. "You were walking out of town with Thomas, and you looked so tired but so determined. I remember thinking you would ride right past me like everyone else," Violet said, lying down beside him and resting her head on his shoulder. "I could not believe you actually stopped to talk to me." "I could not have ridden past you even if I had wanted to," Xavier said. "Something about you just grabbed hold of my heart and would not let go." "I am glad you stopped," Violet said softly. "You changed my entire life, Xavier. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave Thomas a father and me a partner. You gave us a family and a future." Xavier rolled onto his side to face her, propping himself up on one elbow. "We built all of that together, Violet. Your strength, your courage, your refusal to give up even when everything was against you, that is what made all of this possible. I just had the good sense to see what an incredible woman you are." Violet reached up and traced the lines of his face, noting the small crow's feet at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the sun, the deeper tan from years of outdoor work, the silver that was just starting to thread through his dark hair. He was even more handsome now than he had been when they first met, weathered by time and hard work but softened by love and family. "I love you," she said simply. "More than words can express." "I love you too," Xavier said. "And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that." He kissed her then, long and slow and deep, and in that kiss was everything, passion and tenderness, promise and fulfillment, past and future. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling. "We should probably head back before the children burn down the Johnson house," Xavier said with a laugh. "They are probably fine," Violet said. "But yes, we should get back." As they packed up their picnic and headed home, Violet reflected on how much had changed since that day 5 years ago when a traveling cowboy had stopped to speak to a shunned woman and her child. She had been so lost then, so certain that her life would always be defined by shame and isolation. But Xavier had seen her differently. He had seen her worth when nobody else would, and he had given her the courage to see it in herself. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of family life. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father. Xavier would correct anyone who mistakenly called him Thomas's stepfather. Benjamin developed a love of books and learning, dreaming of becoming a teacher someday. Sarah proved to be fearless and adventurous, always climbing trees and chasing after her brothers. In 1885, when Thomas was 10, a young woman came to Petaluma under similar circumstances to what Violet had experienced years earlier. She was alone, clearly pregnant, and facing the same judgment and cruelty that Violet remembered all too well. Without hesitation, Violet reached out to the young woman whose name was Lucy. She offered her work, friendship, and most importantly, she offered her the knowledge that she was not alone. Xavier supported Violet fully in this, even offering Lucy's father work at the ranch when he arrived a few months later, having tracked down his daughter to make amends for throwing her out. Helping Lucy heal from her wounds gave Violet a sense of purpose beyond her family. She became known as someone who would help women in difficult circumstances, offering them practical support without judgment. It was her way of paying forward the kindness that Xavier had shown her, of making sure that no other woman had to face what she had faced alone. By 1890, Xavier had purchased the ranch from the Johnsons, who retired to live with their daughter in San Francisco. The Yates family ranch, as it was now known, was prosperous and respected throughout the area. Thomas worked alongside his father, learning the business and preparing to take it over someday. Benjamin had gone off to teacher's college, making the family proud. And Sarah, at 8 years old, was still the fearless little girl who kept everyone on their toes. On a warm summer evening in late August, the whole family gathered on the large porch of their home for dinner. It was something they did often, enjoying the California sunshine and each other's company. Thomas had brought a young woman he was courting, a sweet girl named Emily who fit into the family easily. Benjamin was home for the summer, full of stories about his studies. Sarah kept everyone entertained with her dramatic retelling of how she had rescued a baby bird that day. Xavier sat at the head of the table, Violet at his side, and looked around at his family with profound contentment. This was everything he had never known he wanted, this noise and laughter and love, this sense of belonging and purpose. After dinner, as the children cleaned up, Xavier and Violet walked through their property, something they did most evenings. They walked hand in hand, comfortable in their silence, watching the sun set over the rolling hills. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Violet asked. "If you had ridden past me that day, if you had decided I was not worth the trouble?" "Never," Xavier said firmly, "because I do not believe in that kind of what-if. I think we were always meant to find each other. Maybe it is fate, maybe it is God, maybe it is just luck. But I know that stopping to talk to you that day was the best decision I ever made." "Mine too," Violet said. "Saying yes when you asked to court me, marrying you, building this life with you, all of it. Even the hard parts were worth it because they led us here." Xavier stopped walking and turned to face his wife. The setting sun bathed her in golden light, highlighting the few silver threads in her hair, the laugh lines around her eyes, the beauty that had only deepened with time and love. "You know what the best part is," Xavier said. "We have decades ahead of us still. Decades more of this life we have built, watching our children grow and have families of their own, growing old together." "I cannot wait," Violet said, standing on her toes to kiss him, and she meant it. The girl who had once believed her life was over, that she would spend her remaining years as an outcast defined only by her mistakes, could now barely remember that darkness. Xavier had brought light into her life, but more than that, he had helped her find the light within herself. The town that had once shunned her now respected her. The child she had raised alone now had siblings and a father who adored him. The future that had once seemed so bleak now stretched out before her, full of promise and possibility. As they walked back to their home, Xavier's arm around her waist and the sounds of their children's laughter drifting through the open windows, Violet knew that she had everything she had ever wanted, and so much more than she had ever dared to dream. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask how Grandma Violet and Grandpa Xavier had met, Violet would smile and say, "Your grandfather was the kindest man I ever met. When everyone else looked away, he looked right at me and saw someone worth knowing, and he changed everything." And Xavier would add, "I did not change anything. I just loved your grandmother the way she deserved to be loved. The rest was all her." But they both knew the truth. They had saved each other. She had given him a home and a family and a reason to stop drifting. He had given her hope and dignity and proof that love could heal the deepest wounds. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of judgment and shame. They had created a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told for generations. And it had all started with a traveling cowboy who said, "Not anymore," when the world had decided that Violet Randall was not worthy of kindness. He had looked at her and seen not a fallen woman but a rising one, and in seeing her that way, he had helped her rise indeed. The Yates family continued to thrive in Petaluma for generations. Thomas eventually took over the ranch, running it with the same integrity his father had shown. He married Emily, and they gave Xavier and Violet 6 grandchildren to spoil. Benjamin became a beloved teacher in Sacramento, changing countless lives through education. And Sarah grew up to become a doctor, one of the few female physicians in California, helping women who had nowhere else to turn. Violet and Xavier lived to see all of their children settled and happy, lived to hold great-grandchildren in their arms, lived to celebrate 50 years of marriage surrounded by the large, loving family they had created. When Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Violet grieved deeply, but took comfort in knowing they had lived a full and beautiful life together. She continued on for another 5 years, still helping women in need, still sewing and spending time with her family, still telling anyone who would listen about the cowboy who had changed her life with simple kindness. The last words Violet spoke before she joined her beloved husband were to her great-granddaughter, a little girl who had been named Violet in her honor. "Remember this, sweet girl," she whispered. "People will judge you for all sorts of reasons, but their judgment does not define you. Only you get to decide who you are. And when you find someone who sees the real you and loves what they see, hold on to them with everything you have. That is what love really is, seeing someone fully and choosing them anyway." Little Violet did not fully understand her great-grandmother's words then, but she would remember them years later when she needed them most. The story of Violet and Xavier became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations, a reminder that love can bloom in the harshest conditions, that kindness can change lives, and that sometimes the greatest love stories start with one person simply refusing to walk away when everyone else has. In the small family cemetery on what had once been the Johnson Ranch and was now the Yates family property, two headstones stood side by side. Violet Randall Yates and Xavier Yates, reunited in death as they had been united in life. And carved beneath their names was a single line that summed up their entire story. He saw her when no one else would, and she taught him what love really means. It was a simple epitaph for an extraordinary love, the kind of love that changes not just two people but entire communities, rippling out through generations. Because when Xavier had stopped on that dusty road to speak to a shunned woman and her child, he had not just changed Violet's life. He had changed the trajectory of an entire family tree, creating a legacy of love, kindness, and acceptance that would continue long after they were both gone. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all, not just the love they shared, but the love they created, the family they built, the lives they touched, and the future they made possible simply by choosing to see the best in each other when the world saw only the worst. Their love story began with a traveling cowboy saying, "Not anymore," to injustice. And it ended decades later with a family so large and loving that it would have seemed impossible to the lonely, frightened woman who had walked the streets of Petaluma with her head down and her heart broken. But Xavier had seen what she could not see then, that she was strong enough to not just survive but to thrive, to not just endure but to flourish, to not just accept love but to give it back tenfold. And so the town that had once shunned Violet Randall for having a child alone became the same town that mourned deeply when Violet Yates, beloved matriarch of one of the most respected families in the area, passed away surrounded by the love she had earned and deserved. Because a traveling cowboy had once said, "Not anymore," and everything had changed.